So what we can do about oilseed rape production from seeding to harvest is the topic of today for the next whatever 80 minutes. And I'd like to give you first an overview of what items we will touch on today. So first, it will be in a kind of overview of what the global acreage and use of oilseed rape is. So let's really indicate somehow in a way to what areas or regions we need to look at when we do kind of forecast on produce price, for instance, because oilseed rape is very much a commodity crop, an oilseed which is traded in the international market. And of course, the demand supply ratio determines very much what the price, market price will be. But of course, for agronomists, it's more important to understand the botany and the growing conditions oilseed rape requires. And this is, of course, managed by our operations in the field. And then we will start as normal the cycle with the tillage and planting. We look at the required nutrition of oilseed rape, pests and diseases, and how we can control those with plant protection measures. And then, of course, if the crop has developed nicely and we have done everything properly, then we can look forward to a good harvest with good yields and quality. We will break for comments for whatever, and after the first part of the nutrition, and then we will continue for another half an hour with nutrition, pest and disease management in the second part of the presentation. When we look at the acreage, I think the production of oilseed rape is very much focused or very much limited to about 12 countries in the world. And you see the biggest chunk is taken by Canada, China, and India. All these areas grow mainly the spring form of oilseed rape because of their either kind of short growing period or hard winters or high temperatures. India is a bit surprising that it's in the statistics, but it's a kind of different type of rapes which is growing there. When we look at Europe, we get high production from Germany, France, and then next to that we have Poland, and also Ukraine produces, according to the statistics, 3.2% of the global oilseed rape production, which means even more than, for instance, UK, definitely more than Czech Republic, and also more than Russia or US, for instance. So it's grown on quite a significant acreage, and the global production is about 27 million metric tons. And it's a very productive oilseed crop because the oil content in the seeds is very high. Normally it's in the order of magnitude of 40 to 45% extractable oil. Oilseed rape is produced 60% of the total vegetable oil in the world, and only on 13% of the area area which is planted with oil crops. And we will come to that in the next slide, what kind of oil crops we have in the world and what the productivity of these different oil crops is. So basically, it's let's say to conclude on that, it's the production of oil is higher than average of all the oilseed crops grown in the world. For instance, when we compare to soybeans, which now is some kind of main oilseed crop in North and South America, they take even 40% of the area. So that means in a way, in terms of oil production, they are less productive compared to oilseed rape because they, on this 40%, they produce only 29% of the total vegetable oil in the world. And as I said, when we look at the acreage or the production, it's what happens in Canada, to some extent in China, but mainly in Canada, and also Europe, determines very much the supply of this oilseed, and of course determines then the price. And as you probably have followed recently, now the price of oilseed rape has increased quite significantly. I think it was, I think 1.5 years ago, it was at 350 euros per ton. And in a way, the recent weeks, some farmers enjoyed in a way prices of 500 euros per ton, which is of course quite an incentive to think about growing oilseed. As you probably know, in Europe, the acreage of oilseed rape has decreased during the last couple of years for a couple of reasons. I think a low price was one of them. Also, it looked like that in this very dry and warm springs we faced at least in the northwest of Europe, the last couple of years, the oilseed rape yield was not very exciting, really. It was kind of very modest, somehow even low yields, and then of course drought and so on, and has also contributed to a kind of significant yield decrease. I think until 3 to 5 years ago, there were kind of development that yield grow towards whatever 5 tons plus per year. I think in the last 3 years, I think growers in Northwest Europe, France, Germany, they were quite happy to achieve 3.5 and 4. And that was, of course, not so profitable anymore as it used to be. And therefore, that was, I think, the main reason for the decreasing acreage. Also, I think there was more pressure on diseases, pest and diseases, and also the banning of kind of important pesticides, insecticides, for instance, and for seed treatment, has made oilseed reproduction more difficult and also more costly in the last couple of years. So a lot of things has contributed to a reduction of acreage and also production. But of course, if we will see prices like today, then this will probably change significantly over the next couple of years. Just to touch on the different oilseed crops to have a kind of idea what the productivity of different oilseed crops in the world is. We have here the statistics saying how much acreage area you need to produce 1 ton of vegetable oil. And you see a couple of crops which are not so well known to us: sesame seed, cottonseed, groundnut, coconut oil, and even olive oil we have in Europe. It takes quite significant acreage to produce 1 ton of oil compared to, let's say, the sunflower seed and also rape and mustard oil. So soybean is somehow in between. Here it looks like the productivity of oilseed rape and sunflower is more or less the same. This applies on a global acreage, but when we look at Europe, in most areas, of course, we get higher yields with oilseed rape compared to sunflower, if oilseed rape is grown in areas where we have the right weather and climate conditions. So, for instance, with a yield of 3.5 to 5 tons, of course, we would need less than 1.4%, less than half of it. That means, of course, in let's say cooler, temperate climate areas in Europe, the productivity of oilseed rape is higher compared to sunflower oil. But of course, as the area becomes warmer, more dry, then sunflower has definitely advantage when it comes to yield, and definitely also on profitability. I think that's so far as a kind of introduction to the acreage and the productivity of different oilseed crops in the world. And as we all know, that oilseed has a very versatile use. The most well-known is, of course, the vegetable oil for human nutrition. It's a good cooking oil, has a high value. But also recently it has been developed towards usage as a renewable raw material for chemical industry, for kind of whatever, washing powders, in glue industry, and so on. We know about the discussions of biodiesel, which has created kind of additional demand for oilseeds, and oilseed rape has been used or is still used for biodiesel production. And of course, it's not only the value of having the oil, it's also energy and protein source in animal feed from the byproduct, which is the cake and the meal. And many growers in Europe add value, or it can gain value out of the oilseed rape because it's a very valuable previous crop in rotations where cereals dominate, because it's done in this kind of rotation is the only broadleaf crop, and of course it can break a lot of pressure on this cereal diseases, etc. When you look at the botany and suitable growing conditions, we know that oilseed rape is a brassica crop, a cruciferous crop, and we have the winter oilseed rape form and the spring oilseed rape form, and those are, of course, different when it comes to the length of the growing cycle and how they are adapted to the different conditions in the different seasons. So the winter oilseed rape is almost 1 year in the field, while the spring oilseed rape only for half a year. And when it's grown in tropical areas like in India and China, it's a bit longer, 8 to 9 months in the field. In Europe, we have the winter form is the predominant form and the more productive form, without any doubt. We have some spring oilseed rape when we go further north, because in areas where the winter hardness is not given, or in a way where the winters are too strong that the oilseed rape cannot cope with the low temperatures and frost, then of course it's given that for growing oilseed rape, we need to look at the spring form, and quite often also the growing season is, for instance, in Canada, too short that they also can only work with a spring form of oilseed rape. When we look at the growing cycle and the management across the growing cycle, In this slide, we have illustrated the cycle of the winter form. As I said, now the crop is almost 1 year in the field, so it needs to be planted in end of August, early September. It has to have a very good pre-winter development in order to gain the winter hardness, and then oilseed rape in our areas is the crop in the field which starts growing the first in the field in spring because it has a kind of low temperature demand for biomass production. And then we face very early in the season the flowering cycle. And this is the one, in a way, the most critical period where the yield is determined based on the pots and seed set. And after flowering, if we have good or sufficient soil moisture that the crop can bear, in a way, all the pots and seeds which has been set, then until harvest, not too much can go wrong anymore. And when we look at the management practice, of course, we have the seeding in autumn, fertilizer. We will discuss what it's needed in autumn, but then, of course, the focus is very much on nitrogen management in spring and how this contributes to yield. We have, I won't touch on herbicides. I think that's something you can get from all the suppliers of herbicides. But herbicide application mainly is in autumn. Sometimes there's a need to do additional one in spring if the autumn one is not sufficiently effective. I don't go into plant growth regulators. I think they are under research so far. Some farmers use them. I think it's still not a kind of standard practice to use growth regulators in oilseed rape. Fungicides are important really to support the crop for a good pre-winter development. And then we have some special diseases in spring we need to watch. And when it comes to pest also, we know a couple of beetles in autumn and in spring we need to watch. And then also we will discuss the need for insecticide application based on thresholds and pressure we will find in the field. So yeah, this is something we would like to go through. Of course, it's really to address different growth stages, as I again illustrated here over time, and of course to focus very much on critical growth stages, which are very much, as I have mentioned already, ready to get a strong crop before winter, and then ready to prepare a crop for the pot and seed set as the most important period for the crop that determines the yield potential later on. So this is the calendar, so to say, for winter oilseed crop. As I said, normally in Europe it goes from August to harvest in July, and for the spring crop, as it says, normally the spring crop is planted sometime in March, April, has a much shorter cycle. The harvest is a bit later in August, and normally the yield of spring oilseed rape is much lower. And the reason why is that the vegetative development, leaf stems, and also the root growth is in a much shorter period of time, so it doesn't give really many days to produce biomass and to prepare the crop to bear high yields, high seed yields. and also the flowering season is arrives in the year at a later stage where we have warmer temperatures, sometimes already some dry weather, where the flowering period is much shorter, and this so the faster these kind of processes go, the higher is the risk that the number of pods set and also seed sets is too low to arrive or to build a yield potential which really satisfies all the inputs we have to have for an oilseed rape crop. So basically, whenever possible, the winter form should be the preferred one, because the yield potential of the winter form is much higher due to the reasons I just have mentioned. What do we need as conditions, and what are the ideal conditions for oilseed rape? When it comes to soils, there need to be kind of free draining soils with medium texture, so a very light soil, sandy soil, at least under conditions where we don't have very kind of regular rainfall is not the most suitable soil, because oilseed rape is quite demanding for, has a high demand for water. Also, all kind of waterlogging is not suitable because, as you know, oilseed rape has a long taproot, and if it, in a way, the rooting depth is limited by water or by compactation, you will see it immediately in the field. The crop will struggle to develop. It is adapted to some salinity, which is not so much a case, or not so much a problem in European soils, at least not in Central Europe and Northwest Europe. And then, as I said, the root, it can go very deep, normally 90, but it can even go further down, 190 centimeters. So ideally, in a way, we have a rooting depth which is more than 100 centimeters, 140 at maturity. This kind of rooting depth has been observed, and you can imagine with this kind of rooting depth and a very good dense root system, the crop is able to extract a lot of whatever water and nutrients from the soil. So it's quite efficient in water and nutrient uptake. Climate, so it's adapted to cool temperature, and under cool temperature we can expect the highest yields. The germination takes place already at low temperatures, so it will start at 5 centigrades already. The optimum would be 10, but that's of course for our winter form not crucial because this happens in summer. So it's definitely not kind of temperature limited. What we have in summer is more moisture limitation to get a good crop stand. The seedling as such is frost tolerant at -4 centigrades. The well-developed crop has, of course, a much higher frost tolerance. I think this winter has been very strong, or the last winter has been very strong. I think it was in February we had temperatures of -10, 15 even. I think in some areas even -20, as you probably have also experienced this year. And if there's a good snow cover, I think the oilseed rape hasn't been impaired a lot. So I think all the oilseed fields look very good, even so it was very cold this winter. Of course, if you have this strong frost without any kind of snow protection and so on, then sometimes we observe frost kill, but in general, I think for our Western European climate, France, Germany, Poland to a large extent, the winter hardiness is sufficient to grow winter oilseed rape. It doesn't like high temperatures, so the optimum temperature is around the 20s. Of course, as soon as we have very hot days, in particular during flowering, this shortens really the period of flowering, and also means that we have lower pod set, etc. Rainfall, ideally 400 to 500 millimeters in the season. When it's lower than 200 millimeters, then there is a kind of yield penalty to that. It needs good water supply, and in particular during flowering, the crop is very sensitive to any kind of water shortage, and also when we have it later, a later drought during rain filling, the seeds have a lower weight, and that means also lower production. So water supply is key, and when you consider this crop for Ukraine, then I think it's very important that we look at areas where we have sufficient water supply for the oilseed rape crop. The winter form is definitely most productive in cool regions, like for instance Canada, China, and Europe. We don't see them too much in other hot areas. Yeah, it's a kind of cool season crop, and under those conditions we can expect very good yield responses. Let's start the season with the tillage. So normally we have a cereal crop, or sometimes a peas as a previous crop. And if the straw is not harvested, we have a lot of residues on top. So the even distribution and the composition of this harvest residues is very important to get to prepare a good seed bed. The seed bed, what we look at is that we try to conserve as much water as possible, and we establish a good capillarity so that the seed can suck in sufficient water to germinate and to develop the root. We should have soil conditions which allow an undisturbed growth of this taproot. As I said, if we have any kind of compaction or even waterlogging and so on, then we will see it in the crop establishment and later in the pre-winter growth. So we need to be careful that we don't have any kind of straw layers in the soil, in the topsoil, because that of course impairs the growth of the taproot, and all kind of compaction is not suitable to develop for the crop development pre-winter. So the seedbed should be well crumbled. So because the seed is very small, and I think the planting should be as accurate as possible. That means there should be good crumbling, but it shouldn't be too fine, because in particular in silt soils, if we have a very hefty rain shower, thunderstorm after seeding, there is of course a risk that we upsilt, seal the soil with a lot of fine particles, and then of course this impairs the aeration of the soil, and of course also air is very important for the germination. So if the seedbed is too fine, then there's of course this risk of upsilting. If soil conditions are quite okay after the harvest of the previous crops, I think low or reduced tillage is definitely possible. to an oilseed rape crop. Sometimes it's maybe even better compared to plowing, because then you can more evenly incorporate yield residues, and also the risk of losing moisture and destroying capillarity is higher when you plow the soil. So if in a way the existing soil properties allow, then reduced tillage should be considered. So the purpose of all this tillage, and of course the seeding later, is that to have a good crop development before winter, because that's the prerequisite for winter hardness, but also then for stable yields. And the aim of all the operations in autumn, late summer, is to develop to establish a crop which reaches about 8 to 10 leaves before winter, and which has a root collar, a diameter of 8 millimeters at least. So this would be a crop which has a very, very high likelihood to cope with a hard winter and to have a good start of growing in spring. When it comes to seeding, of course, I don't discuss the varieties because there are a lot of very regional aspects to that, and you get all the information from the breeders and also from other authorities who are in charge of testing the performance of different varieties. But I think it's important to look at the seeding rate and of course the seeding depths. The seeding rate depends very much on the time left for development before the crop arrives to the winter dormancy. And normally in Germany, also France, the crop is planted already in end of August. Basically, end of August is the D-day for oilseed rape here. And that allows about 12 weeks before winter dormancy. And under those conditions, the recommendation is to use 2 to 2.5 kilograms seed per hectare, and to target plant density of just 30 to 50 plants per square meter. This seems to be very low, but if we have good conditions, this number of plants is sufficient to develop a very, very high yields. And if we can give the crop this time of development, each and every single plant is able to develop to a very strong plant, and to have less very well developed plants is of course a better prerequisite to survive the winter and to have a good growing start in spring than a very dense crop where all the individual plants compete with each other on the resources, water, light, and nutrients. Of course, the further we are in the year, meaning in a way we have less weeks for development, the seed rate needs to be increased because the crop cannot develop the same number of leaves, and the number of leaves pre-winter is very much associated with the potential to branch in spring. And of course, when you have a lower branching potential, then you need more plants per square meter compared to, in a way, a crop which has developed a lot of leaves, meaning also the potential to have a lot of branches next to the main stem. That goes down to, let's say, if it's less than 10, we arrive at about in a way, the target would be close to 100 plants, which is about 4 to 5 kilograms per hectare, depends on the seed weight, etc., and so on. It has been observed that in general, a lower plant density crop is more resistant to frost kill because the individual plants are much better developed. So we can expect that at, for instance, 50 plants, this is a kind of rule of thumb per square meter, that with a hard winter, we lose about 15% of the plants under those conditions. But if we have about 100 plants per square meter, then it can be easily 3 times or close to 3 times these losses. So I think with the number of plants, we can only compensate to a limited extent, in a way, a delay in seeding. So in a way, the right seeding date is very crucial for the oilseed rape crop. I think the seeding depth is not so spectacular to talk about. In general, depends also a bit on soil conditions. If we cannot get it in at 2 centimeters with a kind of good kind of contact to the soil, we can go down to 3.5, 4 centimeters. But it shouldn't be deeper, because if it's deeper, as this graph shows, then the emergence rate goes down quite significantly, and of course then we get a kind of uneven crop stand. So this is something we like to avoid as much as possible. There are results from plant density studies. This one is from Lithuania, which shows the grain yield depending on the seed rate. And as you can see, in Lithuania, they found that with a lower seed number, 95%, they arrived at 95% of the maximum yield, lower than 100 plants per square meter. And then in the range of 100 to 200, I think they achieved the kind of maximum yield. And then as soon as it goes higher than 200, then of course there is a yield penalty to that. I think in Lithuania, this might be because of, let's say, delayed seeding. So the winter wheat crop is normally the previous crop, and it's harvested sometime in August, maybe end of August. So they will arrive at in September before they can plant the winter oilseed rape, and that means, yeah, they have to go for, let's say, 100 seeds at least to get the maximum yield. When you look at the yield components and how the yield is built on the different components, it's quite obvious, as we just discussed. It starts with the number of plants per unit area, but the oilseed rape has a huge potential to branch. So if the number of plants is low, the branching is much more intensive, so it can compensate plant losses quite a lot with branching. And this is something we need to consider in early spring, when we see that, or in end of winter, let's say it this way, when we see that the crop has suffered quite a lot from winter. We lost some plants, and it looks like the plant density is not sufficient to achieve a reasonable yield. But then it depends very much on how the remaining plants look like and what the potential of branching is, because quite often we see that as soon as the crop starts growing, if the space is there, the oilseed rape takes the space with a lot of well-developed branches and can compensate quite significant losses. of plants by this property. Then, of course, we have the number of pods per plant, which is one of the most important yield component, and we need to do everything to get this number very high. The number of seeds per pod is a bit less variable, but also a seed set is important, and then the individual seed weight of the different seeds. What affects this yield? Of course, number what we know, we don't need to talk about too much about this, is nutrition, disease and pest control, and also the harvest conditions. Harvest conditions in the way that, of course, there is always a risk to receive a thunderstorm or sometimes even hail. So this is, of course, poison to oilseed rape because it starts shedding the pods and the seeds, and we can lose quite significant yield by pre-harvest losses. So, yeah, tillage important, as I just said, and then the question is, we need to have a previous crop which is harvested well before the oilseed rape needs to be planted, and those are the cereal crops, and peas, for instance, can be also good previous crops, or potatoes. Many crops you have in your rotation in a starter, like sunflower, maize, and so on, are generally no crops which are suitable in the rotation. Of course, this 60 tons biomass consume a lot of nutrients, and just as a kind of rule of thumb, figures how much nutrients are involved in producing 1 ton of grain. You see these kind of quantities per ton of grain produced of the macro and secondary nutrients, and as we will talk about a bit later, also some micronutrients, in particular boron, plays an important role here when it comes to nutrition of the oilseed rape crop. More for reference, you can see in this table what different yield objectives mean in terms of nutrient uptake, and what is finally removed as a nutrient by the grain. When we look at nitrogen, the 3 tons oilseed rape crop takes up about something between 200 to 250 kilograms of nitrogen. When we aim for 5 tons, I think the oilseed rape is a very demanding crop for nitrogen. We need a kind of supply of 300 kilograms, sometimes even higher than 300 kilograms. This doesn't say that this has to come as fertilizer. Of course, a lot of this can come also from the soil, but we know that oilseed rape has a quite distinct nitrogen demand. The removal by grain is as a kind of high protein seed also quite substantial, but of course when you look at the difference between what is in the crop and what is really removed from the field, you can imagine that the residues like the pod walls, the stem and leaves a lot of nitrogen behind in the soil, and it's quite important that the following crop is able to take this nitrogen residues from the crop in order to protect this nitrogen from losses. Phosphorus is in the order of magnitude of 75 to 95 kilograms for 3 to 5 tons crop. Most of the phosphorus, as you can see, is really in the grain, so there's not too much left behind. And this is different, of course, for potassium. Potassium is mainly in the leaves and the stems, it's less so in the grains, and therefore we need a lot of potassium but only a small part, let's say 20% of that, is really removed by the grain. That means a lot of potassium is left in the field. So the following crop probably doesn't need any kind of potassium fertilizer, because leftovers, the potassium from the residues from the oilseed rape crop is already very high. Magnesium is very similar to phosphorus. Also, I think it's a demanding crop for magnesium, and the majority of magnesium is really in the seed. So the difference is kind of small, just 10 kilograms or a bit more left behind, not like potassium. And then the sulfur we talked about in one of our sessions previously. Oilseed rape is a crop we know has the highest sulfur demand. Basically, for the 3 tons crop, the uptake is 30 kilograms, and for higher yields, we need to go even to 50, 60 kilograms per hectare. And substantial part is removed by the grain, but also the leaves and stems now leave some sulfur in the soil, which definitely can be used by a following winter cereal crop. So we don't need to be concerned about any sulfur nutrition in autumn for following winter cereal. When it comes to the uptake curve during the season, it's quite obvious and very similar to many other crops that we have a kind of peak demand during the stem elongation period, which is very much from growing stage 30 on, up to mid to end of flowering. In particular, the potassium stands out here with a high kind of increase here. The nitrogen, most of the nitrogen is already in the crop at end of flowering. There's hardly or very little additional nitrogen taken up during the grain filling period. So most of the nitrogen which finally ends up in the grain, in the seeds, is the nitrogen which needs or is translocated from the leaves, from the stems, and from the pod walls into the seeds. So if we don't get the nitrogen right until early flowering, I would say, then there's also a risk that we lose a yield potential. How can we monitor whether our oilseed rape has adequate supply? I think leaf analysis is probably the best tool to see whether we are in the right order of magnitude with our nutrients. It's recommended to do it at let's say late bud stage, because at that time there's still the possibility to do some corrections, at least when it comes to micronutrients, but also to some extent with nitrogen. We can help until let's say mid-bud stage, I would say, or early to mid-bud stage. It is recommended to take 30 leaves, the youngest fully developed leaves, and then you have these kind of critical levels at bud stage for the different nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Sulfur is probably most critical when it comes to these nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. At this stage, our phosphorus and calcium, potassium, very difficult to correct at this stage. Of course, if we have a good soil index and a proper seedbed application of these nutrients, or early spring application of these nutrients, then it should be all right. Nitrogen, yes, as I said, nitrogen and sulfur, it can give you an indication whether it's short or in a good supply. And what we need also to watch is the micronutrient status, very much the boron, also molybdenum and manganese as a couple of micronutrients which are most crucial in oilseed rape, and in particular boron and molybdenum we need to watch, because the demand is much higher compared to at least cereal crops. And it's always a question whether we need to have fertilize in autumn. And this has been investigated in a study in Germany, very much in the north of Germany. And they have monitored in many sites. You see, it's 380 sites. The nitrogen uptake as a crop arrived at before winter, meaning if the crop was not, if there was no nitrogen applied. So this is the nitrogen uptake before winter without any nitrogen application. And then at the same plots, they had a nitrogen application of 100 or 200 kilograms of nitrogen. Of course, that's kind of very high rate. It's very much a kind of proof the principle rate. No, don't get me wrong in saying I recommend 100 or 200 kilograms of nitrogen in autumn. The dose can be much, or is definitely much lower. But then they have monitored in a way what the additional nitrogen application in autumn means in terms of additional yield they have achieved as a response to this additional nitrogen application. In decitons means 100 kilograms per hectare. You see, the dots spread quite widely. As normally we will find as a result of this kind of surveys. But based on this study, the conclusion is that the crop has to have at least 50, better 70 kilograms nitrogen in the above ground dry matter. And if the crop is not able to take these 50 to 70 kilograms before winter, then we will get a yield response to a nitrogen application in autumn. And this yield response can be quite significant. It can be, I think, let's say on average, it can be, let's say, 300 to 500 kilograms per hectare. And what we would need as a kind of nitrogen fertilizer application normally is in the order of magnitude of, let's say, definitely not more than 50 kilograms, probably even a bit less. Some starter nitrogen will help here because depending on the previous crop, quite often the upper soil layer is depleted for nitrogen, and to have a good early development, it's recommended to apply nitrogen in autumn if we're not sure that the previous crop has left a lot of nitrogen in the soil. There are results from field trials showing the response to nitrogen application in autumn. As you can see, the control, the green bar, is a seed yield without nitrogen application. And also here you can see it depends on the year. that means depends on growing conditions in autumn, whether we get a kind of very substantial response to nitrogen application in autumn or not. So for instance, you see in 2006, 2007, the application of 40 to 80 kilograms of nitrogen hasn't increased the yield significantly, I would say, but in 2008, 2009, it has been the case. Those years were 2008 very high yielding conditions, and I don't know what I don't recall really in detail what the autumn conditions were, but also if, for instance, planting is delayed, then of course a fast development is even more important, and the autumn application can of course compensate somehow delayed planting, and then we can get also some good responses to autumn application. And for sure, this autumn application, if it's in a kind of reasonable quantity, it's not a loss, because oilseed rape is able to take this nitrogen very efficiently, and it stores the nitrogen either in the leaves or in the root. So oilseed rape, if all the conditions are good, extend a very good root system and can store quite significant amounts of nitrogen in the root. It's not really a risk, but what needs to be avoided that we push a crop too much to too much vegetative growth, because that's also kind of it also increases the risk of frost kill, because then the oilseed rape crop might be developed too much, which of course weakens the tissue and so on. So it's also not recommended to push a crop too much. It should be also in autumn in a very good balance. And when we talk about the rate, what we need to watch also, even so, oilseed rape, you know, it's very hungry for nitrogen, and we get a good yield response to nitrogen, as it is shown here in this graph. The green bars show the yield increase or the yield response to nitrogen. Basically, we get the highest gross margins in this is also a trial from Germany, in the south of Germany even. I think the best margins they get with 180 to 200 kilograms of nitrogen applied. But we need to consider also that the oil content, if the nitrogen becomes excessive, the oil content in the seeds declines quite significantly, because a lot of energy goes into protein and less into the oil. And as in all kinds of oil crops, we quite often observe that, you know, if we apply too much nitrogen, then the oil content suffers, and finally the oil yield. So this is also very important to consider when we plan for the nitrogen application, that any excess doesn't help either. As I said, the nitrogen uptake is shown in this graph. This is a blue line, and the biomass production, the green area of this graph. What is quite obvious, and what we need to make sure that the nitrogen uptake is always ahead of the biomass production. So it needs to have a very high concentration of nitrogen in the biomass, because the biomass, leaf stems and later pods is a storage for nitrogen, and this nitrogen in a way is later used to build the protein in the grain. So for instance, I'd like to highlight very much that the maximum of nitrogen uptake we have already end of flowering. So after that, there is translocation, and we lose even some nitrogen from the crop by what we call litter fall. So we know that the leaves become senescence, and finally they get detached from the stem and fall to the soil. And this nitrogen, of course, is then not anymore in the biomass. So yeah, key message here is really to get all the nitrogen into the crop until end of flowering, because after that there is no chance in a way to correct it anymore. And of course, the peak demand period is very much in a way start of stem elongation up to early to mid flowering. So in this period of time, we need to have a very, very good supply of nitrogen in order to get the highest yield. So when we look at the effect of nitrogen at different growth stage, you can see what the objectives are. The effect if we have undersupply, or in a way what happens if we have an excess of nitrogen. And I think I don't go through all these items here. Pretty clear. Before winter, yes, we need to have a vigorous crop which has sufficient, developed sufficient leaves and biomass. But if we have, and what that I have mentioned already, if we have excessive in winter, the crop is pushed too much, we get very broad leaves, and then also what we call an untimely stem elongation. That means the vegetation point grows, and it's not anymore close to the soil surface, where it has enjoys the highest protection against this winter temperatures. After winter, the development is slow first, but we have to realize that at this stage, the concentration of nitrogen matters quite a lot for a fast recovery, and also to enable a good development of branches, because the branching finally matters for the potential of pod sets. If we have an excess there, in a way with all kind of excess nitrogen, we get a kind of soft tissue, soft stems, and that of course increases the risk that we will get maybe some damages from late frost. Ideally, we split the nitrogen in top dressing in spring. The first one should be at the start of the growing, and then the second sometimes early to mid stem elongation. I think with this kind of strategy and the kind of 50-50 split of the total demand, I think we will get the best results. There is, maybe if there is a shortage, some nitrogen early flowering, what we call late nitrogen, has been tested recently in mainly UK, but also I think in France and Germany, and under conditions where we can expect a very high yield, they found some good response to some additional foliar nitrogen at this stage, and it can be applied in a kind of tank mix with a fungicide, which is quite often a standard practice at flowering to mitigate any risk of sclerotonia disease. And But this applies very much for conditions where we can expect a very, very high yield. So growing conditions which allow still good water supply during grain filling, etc. But here, of course, as I said, we need to be, for all the spring nitrogen, we need to be aware that if an excess of nitrogen doesn't help, because then the oil content might be reduced. How to derive the nitrogen rate in spring and what kind of methods are used. And this is always a question about what is a starting point in spring. Now, how much nitrogen is in the crop after winter? Because research has shown that the amount of nitrogen which is already in the crop in after winter should be considered to quantify how much is still needed to arrive at a certain yield. And as you can see, the amount of nitrogen after winter can be quite versatile depending on the year. So we have here 2 years, 2006, 2007, and in total, I think, 11, 12 sites where they monitored the nitrogen uptake before winter. And basically what we have before winter is similar to what we have after winter. There's only some nitrogen lost by some leaves, but quite often this is not so much. And then amongst the sites, you can see that the nitrogen uptake can vary, in this case from 40, which is definitely too low, to 100 on another site. So all these 60 to 100 in a good order of magnitude. Of course, these others are probably too low and should have been enjoyed some additional nitrogen in spring. The year 2007, you see it's the difference are much higher. So definitely, in a way, crop before winter was more than 200 kilograms of nitrogen, or yeah, I would say everything above 100 kilogram, it can be considered as a kind of excessive nitrogen, and we would probably have some problems with let's say frost hardness because of that. But you can see also in the same year there are some sites which are still at 40. So the difference between different sites and conditions can be quite significant. And as I said, this nitrogen is effective for the growth and finally for the yield, and therefore it should be considered as a kind of starting point when we calculate the nitrogen demand for the spring application. The system was very much developed in France, and it's very much on measuring the biomass yield at the end of the growing period in winter, or it can be done also in spring before the start of the growing. And it's recommended to harvest somehow the green crop and measure the fresh matter weight. And depending on the fresh matter weight and the yield objective, they have calibrated the optimum nitrogen rates to be applied. So, and this is given in this table. So for instance, if we like to go for a 3.5 ton yield or 4 ton yield, and we have fresh matter, let's say a fresh matter weight per square meter of 1 kilogram, the recommendation would be 140 to 160 kilograms for a 3.5 ton yield, and of course for a higher yield, 170 to 200 kilograms. So this is, to my knowledge, let's say the most developed method to derive the optimum nitrogen, total nitrogen rate in spring, and it the results seem to be are quite good. You know that there are now methods developed to measure the fresh matter or the dry matter yield, or the dry matter the dry matter weight per area with remote sensing pictures. This can be also used to derive the optimum nitrogen demand in spring. So basically it follows this kind of chart, the nitrogen recommendation, depending on the amount of nitrogen which is already in the crop. As we know, different yields require different amounts of nitrogen. So for instance, if we have 50 kilograms of nitrogen estimated by the fresh matter growth in the crop already, for the 3.5 ton crops, we would recommend 160. And if we aim for, let's say, more than 5 tons, the total should be about 240 kilograms. This total rate should be split in two applications, normally 50% beginning of the vegetation period and 50% at stem elongation. And the first application should come with a sulfur fertilizer. So an ideal combination of nitrogen plus sulfur is preferable, and the sulfur supply should be in the order of magnitude of 25 to 50 kilograms. Again, depends a bit on the yield objective. The late nitrogen at beginning of flowering can be considered for very high yielding crops, as I said, because this is really to address this kind of critical period and to, in a way, delay a bit the senescence of leaves with some additional nitrogen, and to help the crop, the pod development. And if there is a need to treat this sclerotonia anyway with a fungicide, then a tank mix with some liquid nitrogen can be recommended, and in general we get a yield response to this kind of additional nitrogen in the order of magnitude of 3% with some 20 kilograms of liquid nitrogen applied. I think I need to hurry up just to highlight in a way the very high nitrogen application rates, uptake rates. So in this critical period, the crop takes up about 4 to 6 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per day. So in a way, it's a high uptake rate in a very short period of time, and that's the reason why we need to have, let's say, all the nitrogen or all the nitrogen available to the crop latest at the early bud stage or mid stem elongation phase. When it comes to micronutrients, boron, manganese, and molybdenum are most important here. We need to be aware that the brassica crops like oilseed rape has almost 10 times higher demand for molybdenum compared to cereals. Even so, of course, the quantities of uptake are quite limited. And also boron plays a very important role when it comes to pod set because it supports the pollen tube growth. And there's a peak demand for boron during flowering for this pod set. And in addition to that, if boron is short before winter, then we can observe this kind of hollow stem symptom, and that means also we need to watch it also in autumn whether there's sufficient boron supply for to prepare the crop in the best manner for the winter harvest. I can go very quickly through. This is just what I mentioned, the hollow stalks in autumn as a kind of symptom for boron deficiencies. But most important, probably this is less the case in our areas here, but most important in a way, the need for boron during flowering and pod set. Manganese, very much leaves affected. The crop is demanding for manganese, and in particular, if we have, let's say, high pH, soil pH, then manganese might be not sufficiently available, and then we should consider a manganese foliar application to prevent any kind of manganese shortage. And the molybdenum, the last one I like to touch on, very important for the nitrogen metabolism. So if there's a shortage of molybdenum, the crop cannot use nitrate nitrogen or cannot metabolize nitrogen, nitrate nitrogen properly, and therefore we need to make sure that there is an adequate supply of molybdenum to give the crop the opportunity to develop the sufficient winter hardness, and this is very much in a way by using the nitrate nitrogen coming from the soil. With that, I will finish on the nutrition part and go through the pests and diseases. It's just a few slides with some information what pests and diseases we need to watch and what we can do in terms of plant protection. The most common ones in oilseed rape, in a way, it starts with slugs, which can eat already the small seedlings. So then we have a failure of emergence already. So this might be a reason why maybe low tillage is not so appropriate if we have a very high pressure of slugs. Then, of course, plowing is probably a better measure to control them. Otherwise, they can hide very well in the kind of layer with residues. And then in autumn already, the cabbage stem flea starts eating on the cotyledons. This is a typical damage from this stem flea, cabbage flea beetle. And of course, in a way, by eating, it destroys the emerging crop, and of course, the crop reduces, or in a way, reduces the plant vigor. And finally, we get an unsatisfactory crop density. When we arrive at spring, we know about the rapeseed pollen beetle. So this one migrates into the oilseed rape crop and can destroy the flower buds by feeding on them. As soon as, in a way, the crop starts to flower, then they cannot do. They don't do any harm anymore to the crop, because then the pollen is open. The pollen beetle will feed from this pollen, so then it's not a concern anymore. But as long as we have the crop is in bud stage and we have a high incidence of this pollen beetle, we need to consider measures. The other ones are the seed weevil, and quite often together with the Brassica podmitch. So this one lay eggs into the pods, means they destroy the pods, the larvae, they feed on the seeds, and of course this causes yields, and as a kind of subsequent damage. In a way, this midge can, in a way, uses also the holes in the pods and lays their eggs into the pods and destroy pods even further. And of course, this is loss of seeds and in a way higher risk of seed shedding prior to harvest. So kind of very important yield loss. I think those three guys here are in a way the ones we need to consider. And when it comes to the pest thresholds and controls, normally we need to monitor what happens. So for the flea beetles, normally it comes also from outside, fly into the crop stands, feed on the cotyledons and young leaves, and then the larvae, they go even into the petioles and into the stems. And you can imagine that, of course, this weakens the crop quite significantly. The control point, meaning in a way, when should we consider insecticide application, is if we have less than 50% of plants with feeding points. It should be more than 50% of plants with feeding points. Then we should consider really pesticide application or insecticide application. Seed coating is very effective. I think the ban of neonicotinoids, which were the kind of measure, it has affected also a bit the acreage of oilseed rape in Germany, in the EU, because that was a very effective measure. This lasts for about 4 to 6 weeks, gives the crop quite some good early development, and then as the crop is more developed, then of course the damages matter less. And then of course, insecticide measures, pyrite rates, they work against the flea beetle application in September, October. The rapeseed beetle in spring, so the damages are more pronounced in cold weather and a late bloom, because then the development of the beetle coincides more with the with a flowering, with a bud stage, because the main population develops a bit later. So, and that's the reason also that the spring rape is can be more attacked than the winter form. When it comes to control points, this depends very much on the growth stage. The earlier, the lower tolerance we have against these beetles. So if it's at growing stage 53, very early bud stage, then 3 beetles per plant gives you, should make you consider to do an insecticide application. Later on, it's 5, and as I said, after onset of flowering, they cause no damage anymore, so there's no need to really do consider control. Yeah, there are a couple of other preventive measures. I think you can read them your own. And then there's a seed weevil. Now we're going into the pots, as I said. The control point 0.5 to 1 beetle per plant before the rape blooms, and then if we have a high pressure of pot midge, which is a kind of mosquito, then it should go down even to 1 beetle per 2 plants, because then it's a kind of consequent following damages by this other insect. The most important diseases are shown on this slide here. We have and the incidence depending on the share in the crop rotation, because most of these diseases are kind of very much associated with a kind of a narrow crop rotation. I think the most important ones are scleropenia, the stalk break, which starts at flowering, so needs to be watched at flowering whether there's the need to do any kind of fungicide application. The Foma disease is what we call a stem cancer. Otherwise, this is a leaf symptom, but more important is this stem symptom. This is already, in a way, the incidence starts already in autumn, also weakens the crop, and in a way, a kind of fungicide application needs to be considered in autumn already. This is Verticillium dahlia, a wild then the crop looks a bit like this. It's inside the stems, and destroys the vessels where the water and nutrients go through, and therefore we have the whiting then. Cylindrosporium concentricum, this one in autumn. It's a very much crop rotation disease. You can see if we have more oilseed rape in rotation, even on a low quantity of oilseed rape, we have already a quite high infestation. Then we have this Alternaria black leaf spot, and last but not least, Plasmodiphera claproot, which affects all kind of brassica crops, and it's of course very much a crop rotation disease. When it comes to the management practice on these diseases and to what extent they can be controlled by either choosing more tolerant or resistant variety, also by less oilseed rape in a rotation, we can reduce this disease pressure. And then finally, and as a most frequent management practice, we need to consider fungicide and except verticillium, or we can treat all these diseases with some fungicides. I think the most important one and the one to watch closely is the sclerotinia infestation at flowering. It starts in the axils of the branching, and when the petals fall down and cover these axils, that's a kind of ideal point for infestation. And then if we have pressure for that, fungicide application is common practice. The former, again, it seems like there are some varieties which are more sensitive to former stem cancer than others. I think with the rotation, there's less. Fungicide application should be considered in autumn because now it weakens the crop already before winter. Verticillium is only the crop rotation which is most effective, and Cylindrosporium infestation is already in autumn or up to early stem elongation to bud stage. So again, if there's high pressure, a fungicide application, maybe even in combination with a former fungicide, is recommendable in autumn. And the same applies for Alternaria. There's hardly any other measure than in a way a fungicide. So we should be careful, or in a way, as a kind of different measures to fungicide, is that a blow down of harvest residues can reduce the pressure, and an early harvest can prevent bigger yield losses, because Alternaria in a way contributes to premature opening of the pods, and then we lose the seeds for harvest. And with this, I'd like to finish my journey through the oilseed crop with some key messages. So oilseed rape can be considered as the most productive vegetable oil for regions with a cold spring, as it is. This one, these conditions is very supportive for the flowering and the pod set. So the winter form is 11 months in the field, and the spring form 5 months, but has a lower yield potential and is grown mainly where the winter form is at risk to be frost killed. The winter oilseed rape should be planted in a way that it allows in a development of 8 to 10 leaves before winter for sufficient winter hardness. The seed rate should aim for 30 to 50 plants if we get this 8 to 10 leaves with a seeding date, but can be increased if the optimum date is missed. However, a higher density is prone to higher losses over winter, so it weakens the crop. The base dressing, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, should be applied to the seed bed, and 50 to 70 kilograms of nitrogen uptake before winter are essential and need to be addressed with an adequate nitrogen dressing. 2 nitrogen top dressing in springs are common. The nitrogen rate depends on the amount of nitrogen which is already present in the crop and the yield objective. So the incidence of pests and diseases need to be monitored at most crucial periods in autumn and from bud stage to mid-flowering. A wide crop rotation is the best measure against pests and diseases, but insecticides and fungicides treatments are common practice in oilseed rape. So with this, I'd like to finish my quick, fast ride through the oilseed rape production. And thank you for your attention.